Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Agents of Influence, How the KGB Subverted Western Democracies, by Mark Hollingworth, narrated by Elliot Fitzpatrick. "No," said the priest, "you don't need to accept everything as true. You only have to accept it as necessary." "Depressing view," said Kay. "The lie made into the rule of the world." The Trial, Franz Kafka. Nothing is more dangerous to a state than a political police force and an intelligence service which goes off the deep end at the slightest sign of crisis. Sir Basil Thompson, Director of Intelligence, Home Office, 1919 to 1921. When you chop wood, the splinters fly. Czech proverb. 1. The covert art of war. What baseness would you not commit to stamp out baseness? If you could change the world, what would you be too good for? Sink in the mire, embrace the butcher, but change the world. It needs it. The Measures Taken, by Bertolt Brecht. It is midnight on the 17th of March, 1999, and the stern-faced newscaster on the Russian state TV channel RTR suddenly makes a dramatic announcement. The next item, entitled 3 in a Bed, is not appropriate for viewers under the age of 18. The grainy black-and-white video depicts a middle-aged man frolicking on a bed with two naked, dark-haired younger women in a lavishly decorated flat in Moscow's Polyanka Street. The man in the flickering video, although difficult to identify, appears to be Yuri Skuratov, Russia's powerful prosecutor general. The late-night broadcast was the culmination of an epic power struggle between Skuratov and the Kremlin. 6 months earlier, the Prosecutor General had opened an investigation into allegations of serious wrongdoing by the daughter of President Yeltsin and 2 of his deputy prime ministers. In late 1998, Skuratov filed a lawsuit against the Yeltsin administration, alleging that one of its most senior officials had been paid an estimated $60 million in bribes to obtain lucrative construction contracts, including for renovations in the Kremlin. As the evidence of corruption mounted, the Federal Security Service, the FSB, Russia's most powerful intelligence agency, intervened, and in January 1999 handed the video to the President's Chief of Staff, Nikolai Bodyuzha, a former KGB officer. A few days later, Skuratov was summoned to the Kremlin, and the Chief of Staff played him the murky footage, implied that it could become public, and asked him to resign. Even though he strongly suspected the video was a fake, the prosecutor agreed to step down. But then Skuratov changed his mind, returned to work, and decided to fight back, especially as it was unclear whether the naked man really was him. He knew that his resignation needed to be ratified by the upper chamber of Parliament. These were the days when the Russian Parliament was an independent body and not simply an adjunct to the Kremlin. They asked the prosecutor to testify about corruption in Yeltsin's inner circle. The night before Skuratov's appearance before the Russian Parliament, the infamous video was again broadcast on RTR. The prosecutor refused to resign, and the Russian Parliament's upper chamber supported him, and so RTR decided to show the tape yet again, this time on the program hosted by the notorious and popular media hitman Sergei Dorenko, who announced that Skuratov's behavior would make it harder for Russian parents to bring up their children patriotically. After all, this was the Prosecutor General, not Mick Jagger, who can run around the beach with a naked behind, shouted Dorenko. The involvement of intelligence agents in the smear operation was revealed when a photograph was published of a high-ranking FSB officer delivering the video to the RTR offices in Moscow. Soon afterwards, on the 7th of April 1999, that mysterious FSB officer held a dramatic and unusual live press conference. "The initial evaluation of the videotape indicates that it is genuine," said the spy, with no expression in his voice or face. "The man who looked like Skuratov was indeed Skuratov. He must retire, and there must be a more robust inquiry into this affair." That senior FSB officer was Vladimir Putin. Putin then announced that Skuratov was under criminal investigation by his own office. The next day, Yeltsin signed a decree suspending the prosecutor until the probe was complete. Skuratov's telephone lines were cut, his office sealed, his bodyguards replaced, and he was banned from entering his former workplace and any government building. The power struggle between Putin, backed by the Kremlin, and Skuratov continued for several months until the prosecutor reluctantly resigned. The involvement of the two young prostitutes unquestionably ended Skuratov's career. But no one knew who paid them. One of the girls said that she and a colleague charged $500 per sex session, and they had earned $50,000 over the previous 18 months from entertaining the prosecutor. Putin's use of this crude kompromat video resulted in his rise to power. As a result of Skuratov's demise, Putin's main presidential rival, Yevgeny Primakov, was severely damaged because he had been the prosecutor's political patron. Primakov had been often and openly referred to by Yeltsin as his successor, and now he was compromised by his association with the man in the sex video. Putin had protected Yeltsin, who paid him back handsomely by backing his presidential bid. And when he entered the Kremlin, Putin repaid his gratitude by granting all members of Yeltsin's family immunity from criminal prosecution. But if it were not for the honey trap and the video, Putin may have never become president of Russia. The smearing of Skuratov was a classic FSB tactic, inherited from its predecessor, the KGB. The video had been made nearly a year before being shown to the prosecutor, and months before he launched the corruption investigation. It was stored away to be used at an opportune moment as blackmail by threatening public disclosure. Moreover, it emerged that the prostitutes had been hired by a third party, and so the FSB kompromat operation was akin to a trawler, gathering anything and everything in its path, just in case the netted fish produced something incriminating against a potential target. This cannot be dismissed as a one-off incident, for it encapsulated the most important secret weapon in the intelligence war against the West for the past 100 years, and can be summed up by one Russian word, zapachkat. It means to besmirch or make someone dirty, and it has been a crucial component of advancing Russia's interests and foreign policy right up until the war in Ukraine in 2022. For Putin, then director of the FSB, zapachkat and covert operations to destabilize the West have been a key component of his foreign policy. After all, he had been a KGB officer between 1975 and 1991, and was acutely aware of the power of the security services. What amazed me most of all was how one man's effort could achieve what whole armies could not, Putin said later. One spy could decide the fate of thousands of people. He may as well have been quoting Sun Tzu, often cited by former KGB officers as an inspiration, who wrote in The Art of War, "The skillful leader subdues the enemy's troops without any fighting. He overthrows their kingdom without lengthy operations in the field." Putin had joined the KGB after reading espionage novels about its heroic exploits against the Nazis during the Second World War, and watching films like The Sword and the Shield, a title drawn from the Secret Service emblem. The inconspicuous Putin was perfect spy material. His first posting was in St. Petersburg, where, for 9 years, according to former KGB officer Oleg Kalugin, he harassed dissidents and ordinary citizens and hunted futilely for spies. In 1985, Putin was transferred to Dresden, East Germany, where he served in the First Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence. Using a cover as a translator, he recruited informants, procured intelligence, and sent reports to Moscow. Much of his work involved mundane paperwork, but he did oversee Soviet illegal spies working without diplomatic cover. An insight into Putin's pedantic, ascetic personality emerged when he visited East German breweries. "I would order a 3-liter keg," he recalled. "You pour the beer into the keg, you add a spigot, and you drink straight from the barrel. So I had 3.8 liters of beer every week, and my job was only 2 steps from my house, so I didn't work off the extra calories." But he is remembered as a tough and relentless negotiator. The goal, Putin said, was to uncover information about the main opponent, NATO. "What I was doing, which was my speciality, was political intelligence," he said. "I was engaged and researched in international politics, and I never regretted working with the External Intelligence Department of the Soviet Union." Oleg Kalugin and former Stasi chief Markus Wolf are disparaging about Putin's intelligence career and argue that his espionage activities were limited to assessing unimportant reports from informants about foreign visitors. His work may have been dull, but his KGB career influenced his mindset towards the West and the use of intelligence. "A few years ago, we succumbed to the illusion that we don't have enemies, and we have paid dearly for that," he later told the FSB. But there is an intriguing subplot to his career in the secret world. Catherine Belton, author of the authoritative Putin's People, argues that Putin has deliberately downplayed his role as a cover for more sinister operations. She documents how the Russian president was involved in coordinating the support for the left-wing terrorist Red Army faction, whose members frequently hid in East Germany. As a KGB lieutenant colonel, Putin was expected to spend 25% of his time conceiving and implementing what the KGB called active measures, political warfare as a tool of foreign policy. This involved covert operations to influence and destabilize NATO, especially the USA and the UK, by the use of disinformation, forgery, paying agents of influence, honey trapping, secret placement of media stories, and setting up front organizations. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 devastated Putin. His final days in Dresden left a lasting impression on the young spy. On the 5th of December 1989, a crowd of demonstrators surrounded the local KGB headquarters, and Putin confronted them. "Don't try to force yourself into this property," he told them. "My comrades are armed and authorized to use their weapons in an emergency." The group withdrew, but an agitated Putin telephoned the headquarters of a Red Army tank division to ask for protection. The answer was a life-changing shock. "We cannot do anything without orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent." Confounded, Putin spent his final days of the Cold War destroying documents. "I personally burned a huge amount of material," he recalled. "We burnt so much stuff that the furnace burst. We burned items night and day. All the most valuable items were hauled away to Moscow." Crowds demonstrated outside the KGB outpost. "Those crowds were a serious threat," Putin added. "We had documents in the building, and nobody lifted a finger to protect us. I got the feeling then that the country no longer existed." The phrase, "Moscow is silent," haunted Putin for decades afterwards. Political elites could be supplanted, regimes could be overthrown, the security of the state could be dismantled. On entering the Kremlin in late 1999 as acting president following Yeltsin's resignation, Putin systematically restored the KGB to control all levers of political and financial power. A few days after becoming acting president, Putin visited KGB headquarters and addressed 300 intelligence officers. A group of FSB operatives, dispatched undercover to work in the government of the Russian Federation, is successfully fulfilling its task, he joked. Instruction number 1 of the attaining of full power by the KGB has been completed. But the reality was deadly serious. He swiftly installed former KGB veterans into all areas of Russian life. Known as the Siloviki, power guys, they controlled the key government ministries, law enforcement agencies, and state-owned companies. A research report in 2006 found that 78% of the Russian elite had ties to the security services. These people represented a psychologically homogeneous group, ultra-loyal to roots traced back to the Soviet political police. Putin had created a neo-KGB state, and he articulated this reality 6 months after becoming president, when he was asked questions about a former KGB officer. "There is no such thing as a former KGB man," he replied. The use of active measures by Russian spies has also been revived as an insidious weapon of foreign policy, notably in Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. Putin does not regard war and politics as separate spheres. He rejects the West's notion that the world fluctuates between conflict and peace. Instead, he adheres to the view of General von Clausewitz, incidentally much read by KGB officers, that war is simply a continuation of politics by other means, sometimes military, like the invasion of Ukraine, but usually clandestine intelligence operations against adversaries. But active measures are more pervasive than mere propaganda. For the KGB and the FSB, political warfare involves covert funding of politicians, disinformation, and recruiting agents. The aim is to exert influence by any means possible in order to curry favor, negotiate diplomatic and military outcomes, and manipulate public opinion. And then there are the dirty tricks: forged documents, doctored photographs, blurry videos of illicit liaisons with prostitutes hired by the secret state, planted drugs, assassination, smears using black propaganda techniques via covert front groups, and blackmail. But kompromat contains an extra dimension. It is not always used, and is instead dangled in front of an official, who then faces perennial uncertainty about his or her status, frightened that such information could be used to destroy their career, even if it is false. If everyone sees potential landmines everywhere, it dramatically increases the price for anybody stepping out of line, said the Russian academic Elena Ledeneva. It is the fear that generates the vulnerability and the willingness to work for a hostile state like Russia, and how far they will go. Such malign tactics are not relics of the Cold War, but alive and flourishing in Putin's Russia. They are enabled and expanded by technology and adapted for a globalized world. Their modern incarnations are much more terrifying, with far greater range, speed, and impact via the Internet, and so they are able to influence popular and elite opinion on a frightening scale. As the intelligence expert and author Edward Lucas noted, Russia's spy masters are now using not only old tools against us, but also new ones of which their Soviet-era predecessors could only have dreamed. Today, the KGB no longer exists, but its legacy operationally lives on in the FSB and the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency and successor to the KGB. The only real difference is the technology that enhances the methodology. The ghost of the KGB's past not only lingers, but haunts. State-sponsored assassination of dissidents, Alexander Litvinenko; persecution of dissidents, Alexei Navalny; disinformation, social media; honey trapping, Anna Chapman; secret illegal surveillance, hacking of emails, and subverting democracy, 2016 US presidential election. Russia may no longer be a communist regime, but it remains an authoritarian superpower governed by a former KGB spy who is surrounded by former KGB officers determined to restore the Soviet Union and cash in on its oil and gas resources. Western intelligence agencies also implemented some of these measures. During the Cold War, the CIA was actively engaged in regime change and orchestrating coups, notably Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Cuba in 1961, and Chile in 1973. America's spies also secretly owned and funded news outlets around the world and recruited journalists as agents of influence. And Radio Free Europe, a CIA-funded station, often deployed disinformation in Eastern Europe. But America's worst excesses in political warfare were eventually curtailed by the checks and balances imposed by its legal and political system. The Soviet agencies were untroubled by such unwanted and troublesome interventions. The problem is that you can't do to them, Russia, what they do to you, remarked Estonia's President Thomas Hendrik Ilves after his country was cyber-attacked by Russia in 2007. You can't disrupt their elections, particularly since they are already decided. This lack of accountability, especially in Putin's Russia, has enabled the KGB and the FSB to implement such covert active measures and influence operations without any fear of repercussions. On an official level, the FSB, like its predecessor, the KGB, is a state within a state, immune from any accountability, and so can run amok. Now it has become the state. In their seminal book on the Russian secret state, The New Nobility, Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan liken the FSB to the Mukhabarat religious police in Saudi Arabia, impenetrable, ruthless, and brutal. The intelligence bureaucracy considers itself above criticism, impervious to the demands of democracy. And in this system, Zapachkat in Russia and abroad is crucial and encouraged. It is the weapon by which power and influence is exerted. Throughout the Cold War, the KGB was used as a ruthless instrument of that power, rather than a mere intelligence-gathering agency. The covert operation selected in this book unveiled the hidden hands of Russia's dealings with the West, the use of espionage for manipulating opinion, for influence, and ultimately for military and political power, which clearly resonates well into the 21st century. Political warfare. Political warfare, the use of covert operations to influence and subvert events in foreign countries, has been an instrument of foreign policy for centuries. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu, writing in the 5th century BC, stressed the importance of undermining the enemy's will through the use of secret agents who can create cleavages between the sovereign and his ministers, and leak information which is actually false. And the ancient Indian treatise Arthashastra provides detailed advice on how to destroy the morale of political enemies by spreading false rumors and engaging in political intrigue. In Russia, the ruthless use of a secret police force was integral to the political culture of dictatorship. From the very first ghastly dawn of her existence as a state, she, Russia, had to breathe the atmosphere of despotism. She found nothing but the arbitrary will of an obscure autocrat at the beginning and end of her organization, wrote Joseph Conrad in his essay Autocracy and War. Autocracy has molded her institutions and with the poison of slavery drugged the national temperament into the apathy of a hopeless fatalism. The roots of the KGB can be traced back to the Tsar's secret police force of the 16th century, confided Dick White, former head of both MI5 and MI6, to fellow intelligence officers during the Cold War. Known as the Oprichniki, the Thing Apart, it was set up by Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, as an instrument to enforce autocratic rule in certain wealthy areas and detect subversion. As in Stalin's Russia, Most of the treason that it swept away existed only in the mind of the oprichniki and its ruler. Its victims included whole cities. Ivan himself oscillated between periods of sadism and prayer and repentance, and after a 7-year reign of terror, the oprichniki was disbanded. The next political police force was Peter the Great's Preobrazhensky Prikaz at the end of the 17th century. Those who perished in its torture chambers ranged from nobles who had tried to evade state service to drunks who had dared to make jokes about the Tsar. Peter the Great is remembered as the pioneering modernizer of the Russian state, but he used his spy agency as a weapon of fearsome cruelty. Yet today he is revered, not least by Putin, who installed a towering bronze of the visionary Tsar, which looms over his ceremonial desk in the cabinet room. "He will live," declared the Russian president, "as long as his cause is alive." And during the Ukraine war, Putin has likened himself to Peter the Great, equating Russia's invasion with the Tsar's expansionist wars. After the Napoleonic Wars, a new agency was formed in 1826. Known as the Third Section, it sought to distance itself from its predecessors and grandly referred to itself as the moral physician of the nation. Instead, the Third Section was tasked with monitoring and crushing political dissent and operated in tandem with thousands of police officers and innumerable paid informers. Its surveillance reports on Russia's citizens were then distributed to the Tsarist regime. "Public opinion," declared the Third Section's Count Alexander von Beckendorf, "is for the government what a topographical map is for an army command in time of war." Throughout the 19th century, political activity was criminalized, and in 1845, Tsar Nicholas issued a law which laid down draconian penalties for all persons guilty who aroused disrespect for sovereign authority. Dissidents were deported in marching convoys to a bitterly cold exile in Siberia, based on Third Section investigations. Many were raped, trafficked and flogged, or died from malnutrition. But after the fatal stabbing of the Third Section's chief in 1878, a new state security apparatus named the Okhrana was instituted to eradicate political activity. Opponents of the Tsar were executed, and Okhrana officers were empowered to imprison and exile suspects on their own authority. The Okhrana was a law unto itself, an elite within an elite. "Every country has its own constitution," a prominent Russian remarked to the German diplomat George Munster at the time. "Ours is absolutism, moderated by assassination." By 1908, Lenin had developed new underground networks which sought to overthrow Tsarist absolutism by organizing workers into a mass movement that was too populous for Okhrana repression. But the Tsar's secret agents continued to penetrate the revolutionaries, report on their plans, and remit secret material. Their foreign agency, based in Paris, kept the Bolshevik insurrectionists under trans-European surveillance, notably by bribing concierges in hotels. To counter the Okhrana's highly paid informants, the insurgents held clandestine meetings and were adept at writing secret letters which were sewn into the lining of clothes, but only on linen because it did not rustle loudly if a courier was searched. The overthrow of the Tsarist autocracy in 1917 was achieved by peasant discontent and brutality. "How can you make a revolution without firing squads?" asked Lenin at the time. "Do you really believe that we can be victorious without the very cruelest revolutionary terror?" Soon he instituted people's courts, which were mob trials in which barely literate judges ruled on cases based on revolutionary justice. But the Bolshevik seizure of power also relied on propaganda, political influence techniques, and covert operations. "We must be ready to employ trickery, deceit, law-breaking, and withholding and concealing the truth," declared Lenin. "There are no morals in politics, there is only expedience. The Bolsheviks' first intelligence agency was formed on the 20th of December 1917, with the ostensible mission of defending the revolution against its enemies. Known as the Cheka, it deployed agents provocateurs.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?